We're going to get started so we can get everybody out for the rest of their evening. I'm Tricia Erickson, Director of Communications, and I'm just briefly going to let you know that this lecture with Tom Barry is being recorded in a couple of different ways. It's going to be broadcast on Maine Public Radio, and also we're live streaming this event, and we had a request from University of Glasgow to watch this event, so we have people around the world wanting to watch Mr. Barry speak. So just so you know, you're in company around the state and around the world. So I'm going to hand over the introduction to President DeLugos.
Good evening. I'm Jim DeLugos, President of St. Joseph's College. I'd like to welcome everyone here this evening for a very special presentation. The melting of the polar ice caps has opened up new economic potential in the Arctic Circle, but climate change and increased human activity have a broad range of ecological impacts. This evening's speaker, Tom Barry, has just literally come from the closing of the Arctic Council meeting in Portland. Tom, who has a master's degree in environmental geology from University College Cork, is Executive Secretary for the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna, the Biodiversity Working Group of the Arctic Council. In this role, he coordinates and works with a diverse range of stakeholders throughout the Arctic through processes such as the Arctic Biodiversity Assessment and the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program to facilitate more rapid detection, communication, and responses to biodiversity-related trends and pressures affecting the circumpolar world. This evening, Tom will discuss threats to Arctic biodiversity, how what happens in the Arctic has consequences around the globe, including here in Maine, and what the Arctic Council is doing to conserve biodiversity, something we should all care about. Please join me in welcoming Tom Barry.
Thanks very much. Oops. I think you said everything I was going to say anyways. So my name is Tom Barry, and I work within the Arctic Council, and I live here up in the far north of Iceland, which I just was trying to figure out was well over 2,500 miles from here. So before we had our meetings here in Maine, I never thought of Maine as an Arctic state or a near Arctic state as it's described. So it's been a pleasure to be here for the last couple of weeks. What I do is I work within the Arctic Council, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with that, it's an intergovernmental forum where all of the various Arctic states, Russia, Canada, the US, the Nordic countries, and then a lot of other countries like Mongolia, India, China, all these countries come and they sort of have discussions about how they should manage and what they should do in the Arctic. If anyone has any questions, please stop and ask me, because I've been sitting in meetings for the last 6 days. So I'm quite happy to stop when I'm speaking as I go through things. So this big red boundary here that you see, this is the Arctic as we define it within the group where I work within the Arctic Council. Now, the Arctic Council is a unique body in that it's not just the Arctic states that are part of it, but it also is the only regional or global forum where indigenous organizations have a seat at the table with the Arctic states. So whenever the Arctic states are discussing issues to do with invasive species, shipping, or whatever might be on the agenda, they're obliged to consult with the indigenous organizations that sit around the table. So it makes for a very thorough and much more sort of inclusive approach to trying to come together to discuss how we're going to address all the changes that are taking place in the Arctic. So the Arctic Council is comprised of about 6 different working groups, and each one deals with a different thematic area. The area that I deal with is biodiversity. So my group is called the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna, or CAFF. So as soon as you start to work on Arctic issues, it's like a whole other language of acronyms, and it can be quite confusing. What we actually do in the group I work in, CAFF, we conduct monitoring of what's happening in the Arctic. We conduct assessments based upon the results of our monitoring. And based upon the outcomes of that, we develop policy or science recommendations that we then deliver to the Arctic states to try to help inform better decision-making and policy-making in the Arctic. So we are that type of a group that sits between science and policy. So we try and take the work of scientists and interpret it into a form that policymakers might better understand and might better be able to use. So in a way, we try to make things simpler for other people who are non-experts to understand and try to determine how best they might react to all the rapid changes and challenges faced in the Arctic. So what I was going to do was run briefly through some of our key sort of monitoring and assessment programs to give you an idea of the type of work that we do. So the way that my group is structured is that there's a board that I work under where you have representatives from the environment agencies or ministries of the different Arctic states. And in the case of the US, it's the US Fish and Wildlife Agency that represents the United States on the board of CAFF, and they then help direct the activities of the working group. So one of our key challenges in the Arctic is that it's a huge area. It's 32 million square kilometers, as we define it. That's almost 6% of the surface of the Earth. And in that area, there's such rapid changes taking place that our key challenge is how do we take science or monitor or understand what's happening and in as short as time as possible deliver that information to policymakers or key people who can make appropriate decisions. So our challenge is how do we shorten that response time between when we observe something is happening, when we figure out what to do about it, and we give those options to people who can then take the decisions. And one of the key tools that the Arctic Council or the Arctic states are using with regards to biodiversity to determine this is something called the Circumpolar Biodiversity Monitoring Program. So this is where we take a look at the Arctic and we look at the marine ecosystem, the freshwater, terrestrial, and coastal, and we try and identify key components of each of those ecosystems that we then monitor. And those key components are important because if there's a change in those components, if it's polar cod, it starts to go up or down or whatever the case might be, then that indicates that something's happening that we need to take a closer look at, and then we focus our attention on that. As I said, please, silence is always good too, but if you have any questions, you can stop and ask me. We've just recently released also the first sort of circumpolar assessment of biodiversity across the Arctic. And this, for the first time, we took together and integrated all the existing knowledge on biodiversity that could be accessed. And this provides us with our sort of digital baseline. Our monitoring program then provides the engine that we can use to try and focus on more specific issues or challenges as they arise. In your introduction, your college president mentioned that what happens in the Arctic affects everywhere else. And I was trying to think of a nice way to demonstrate that. And perhaps the easiest way to demonstrate it is when you think of migratory species. And in this case, I'm talking about migratory birds. So one of the challenges with many of the migratory birds that we face in the Arctic is that they spend part of their life, their yearly annual span in the Arctic, and then part elsewhere down in the Americas or the LOC or different places. And if we're to have effective conservation plans to conserve those species, it's not enough that we try and conserve them in the north of Russia and not down in the LOC. So it requires a sort of equal cooperation between Arctic and non-Arctic states to try and conserve these migratory species. And these lovely different coloured loops, they represent flyways upon which different groups of species migrate on an annual basis back and forth from the Arctic to other areas. And of course, one of the challenges we're facing is that many of these species are threatened or have difficulties. And these figures here show the declines in migratory shorebird populations along these routes. As you can see here in the Americas and along the Pacific, there's quite a large decline, but it's in East Asia and Australasia we've got a huge decline. And there we have specific species that are really threatened by coastal reclamation and developments in China, Korea, and other places like that. So one of the key challenges for the Arctic and the Arctic Council now is how do we engage those states in this conservation action? So at the meeting I was in Portland now for the last couple of days, you had representatives from Singapore, from Japan and Korea and different countries there who are all very interested to discuss how they can contribute to scientific or conservation work to help address these issues, because they see that as their direction or role in working with the Arctic states through the Arctic Council. This little species here, it's almost like a poster bird for conservation. It's called a Spoonbill Sandpiper. And about 30 or 40 years ago, there was about 6,000 breeding pairs of these birds still there. But now it's declined by, I think it's something like 26% annually. And if that decline continues, they estimate that it has in danger of going extinct and maybe in the early 2020s. So it's one of the challenges is how do we work with the states where that bird travels and find a way in which we can ensure that their stopover sites, their winter and summer breeding sites are conserved as well. So these are one of the issues that we try and work very closely with. This is another very nice species as well. It's called the red knot. And I was just reading a paper that came out in Science the other day where they were tending to suggest that because of the change in the breeding season, birds are being born earlier or later and they're smaller. It's having an impact upon their survival rates because when they travel down to the Yellow Sea, for example, the birds themselves become small. They might be smaller. Their beaks, they tend to suggest, are a little bit smaller as well, so they can't dig as far into the ground to get the food supply that they usually depend upon. So there you have a very nice example of how climate change is directly impacting a particular migratory bird that travels from the Arctic down there. I see people nodding their heads very. I'm not a geologist, as I was said in the introduction. I'm actually a geographer. So I always like to show maps in everything that I do. And one of the things that you'll often hear about the Arctic is that we don't know enough information, that we don't have enough to act. And I'm afraid scientists always say they don't have enough information and they always want more. And I don't think that will ever change. And this is a great map from, I think, 1900 or 1895, so it's not that long ago. But yet the center of the Arctic was a big mass of unknown regions. But there is an awful lot of information out there in the Arctic. So we do have a lot of information that we can start to base suggestions for what might be done to help respond to the various changes taking place. And all these different nice multicolored points and lines here, they represent different places where monitoring of biodiversity takes place in the freshwater and the marine and terrestrial environments across the Arctic. So you can see there's a huge amount of activity going on. And the challenge that we face in the Arctic is not so much a lack of information, but also the need to standardize that information and to integrate it. Because very often, a lot of this monitoring or scientific work goes on in silos or independently of one another. So very often it's difficult to get that information together in a format where you can compare it and make sort of broader key findings and recommendations for the whole Arctic region as such. So what we try to do, for example, in our monitoring, biodiversity monitoring plan for the Arctic, is we divide the Arctic up into specific Arctic marine areas, these different multicolored areas. And in those, we've identified specific components of those ecosystems that we try and measure and monitor through the activities conducted in all these different areas. And based upon that, we're in the process now of developing the first sort of integrated report for the Arctic Council on the state of the Arctic's marine biodiversity. And that was one of the items that we were discussing for the last couple of days here in Portland. And from that report, we'll come with a range of key findings stating, the state of monitoring, if we have information, if we don't. But we'll also come with a whole range of advice or recommendations for policymakers that the Arctic states, when they meet next year, they have a ministerial meeting, that we'll present that report to them, and then they can take it under advisement, they can look at it, or they can approve it or endorse it, but it will give them some indications of actions that they might need to take in response to the changes happening in the Arctic's marine environment. Yeah? Yeah, two questions at once. Down here? That's actually, it's trawl surveys, and it's a nice example of, you have Greenland, Iceland, Greenland, and Norway are together trying to standardize how they collect information when they're doing trawl surveys. And those little lines are where their sort of annual surveys take place. Sorry?
Are all those stations, are they owned by the Arctic Council?
No, they wouldn't necessarily all be stations. It could be just places where monitoring has taken place or where scientific research has gone on at some stage. So they might be just points where people conduct repeated measurements, but not necessarily a station. Yeah?
We have microphones to catch.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
The audience can't hear
Yeah.
questions.
Okay.
Just raise your hand, but don't start speaking
Okay, that stopped all the questions straight away anyway. But so what we're trying to do, like with this report that we're coming out for this ministerial meeting next year, this is an example of the type of information that comes from it. So for the marine environment, we've got a whole range of expert networks on marine mammals, on seabirds, on benthos, on fish and plankton and so on. And all of these different multicolored items here indicate if there's enough data for us to actually infer or make findings or conclusions on what's happening in the Arctic. Because one of the key challenges, it's not the sort of sexiest thing in science, but it's perhaps something that underlines everything, is access to integrated information in a standardized way. And that's one of the key roles that we do within the Arctic Council, within our working group, CAFF. We also produce a whole range of other tools because, these long-term assessments, they can take many, many years to come to fruition. So we also have a whole range of what we call high-level indicators where we try to track what's happening across the Arctic. And this is just one of them that's going to be released now in the next couple of days. And this deals with protected areas across the Arctic. So you can see that about 11% of the huge area that CAFF operates within has some form of protection. In the terrestrial environment, it's quite large. It's almost 20%. And in the marine environment, it's about 4.5%. But what we don't know is the nature of that protection. We can only say the extent and coverage, but we don't know, for example, in northern Russia, what exactly they're protecting in comparison with, let's say, if Maine was on this map, for example. But what we try and do then is we try and take that information and transfer it into a form that Arctic states can actually use when they're working with various different global fora. So the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity is a multilateral environmental agreement that the majority of states, except the US actually, are party to, and where they try to map what's happening with biodiversity in the world. And as part of that process, they've set up a whole range of targets called the Aichi targets. And that's where they try to say we're going to try and conserve X% of biodiversity under all these different targets. And one of those is protected areas. And you can see that for this red line here, that in the Arctic, at least the extent and coverage of protection exceeds what the United Nations has set as its target for 2020. But when you look at the marine, which is what most people think of when they think of the Arctic, it's far below the target that's hoped to be reached by 2020, which is only a couple of years away. So we try and take science, transfer it into a form like this that can give messages visually, quickly, and in a form that people who have the ability to make decisions can understand and make use of. So this is just gives you a small example of all the different types of material that CAFF produces. So it's like a vast pyramid scheme. So we have a small office at the top, and then we have lots and lots of different networks of scientists working on marine mammals, none on amphibians, I'm afraid. But, and we produce a whole range of assessments and reports, so it's an ever-increasing amount of material that's coming out there. And all of this material is funneled into the Arctic Council structure. The Arctic states, they have their foreign ministers sit around this council, and then they look at all this information and they try and make recommendations for what might need to be done to try and better respond to the huge changes taking place in the Arctic. So one of the challenges, of course, as well, is that there's no treaty or no legally binding aspect to the Arctic Council. We're a consensus-based organization, so whatever is discussed around the Arctic Council table, everyone has to agree to it. But even if they agree to something, it's not legally binding. It's just an agreement that, yes, we should do something on this, and then the states decide if they want to put efforts into that. Yeah, I always think this is a nice picture. They look like they're taking a break. But, of course, when you hear people talking about the Arctic, it's very much focused on climate change. And, of course, it is a climate change story. But it's also, at least in terms of the marine Arctic, it's very much a habitat story. So we have disappearing sea ice. You have a huge range of sea ice-dependent biodiversity, from whales to walrus to birds. And bit by bit, their habitat is changing. It's almost as if your neighborhood was slowly being destroyed away at the edges, and before you knew it, your center of your town was slowly being taken away. And it's an extremely dynamic environment, the most dynamic it has ever been. And that's the challenge that we face, is how do we monitor and how do we follow and how do we assess what's happening in that environment so that we can provide for better decision-making in the Arctic. So it's quite a challenge, but I have to say it's one of those things that's really fascinating. I've never had a job before where I've got such a kick out of working that I find it hard not to work. Because you have that very small potential that whatever you do might make a small difference. So if there's any students here looking to work in these type of things, I thoroughly recommend it, because it's a great example to work within something like the Arctic Council, and you can see how your science might actually make an impact in reality, as opposed to being hidden in some peer-reviewed journals or assessments. And we rely an awful lot on our work is done on a voluntary basis by scientists who are very concerned about what's happening in the world, and they want their work to make an impact. And they've decided that, okay, the only way you can do that is we try to influence decision-making, and by doing that, we try and participate in these large multilateral assessment activities and monitoring programs so that their work might actually come to a decision that is going to make a change in the Arctic. So it's a fascinating thing. So if there are people here studying science or whatever it might be, it doesn't necessarily have to be science. There's a huge aspect to our work as well, which looks at mainstreaming of biodiversity. So when activities take place in the Arctic, how do you ensure that biodiversity is taken into account when they're developing areas, when they're starting to extract oil, when they're starting to, operate along new shipping lanes and things like this. So it's a fascinating topic. Has anyone any questions? I see everyone's just very.
Tom,
Yeah?
is this on? Tom, can you tell us why you got involved in the first place, and what was the most interesting thing that sort of caught you? How did your passion develop?
Well, it was a woman, so I met my now wife, and she dragged me to Iceland, and I accidentally ended up in this, because I used to be an archaeologist and then in geography, and somehow I just ended up in this by accident. But it's a fascinating topic, that how do you take your university education and how do you actually apply it in a manner that actually results in meaningful change for the society around you. So I would say that perhaps the best thing we've done so far is, I mentioned this Arctic Biodiversity Assessment, and that was a 7-year process. It was like maybe 300-400 scientists involved in it from across the Arctic and beyond. And that assessment, once it was produced, it was like this huge 700-page document. And we worked to try and reduce that to a form that might actually reach a policymaker's table, and it went from 700-odd pages to 10. But as a result of that document, the Arctic now, countries have a framework for how they can look at conservation actions, and you can see that that assessment has resulted in changes within UN discussions and how they start to recognize Arctic biodiversity as an issue that needs to be addressed and things like that. So when you see small, tiny changes like that, it's very exciting. And I gave you the example of migratory birds. That's something that's starting to take off now, because such an interest from shipping countries like Singapore and Korea, and they start to focus on how they can contribute to science, and they start to sit down at the table with us. And we go to Singapore now in January to meet with all those regional countries and to discuss how they might actually contribute to conservation of Arctic species. So when you're having those sort of discussions, it's quite nice to see that the science can result in action. Not all the time, but that it can lead to it.
I had a question to build on that one, which is, I was fascinated by your chart about how you have all the scientists generating data and you have the policymakers on the other side, and then you have this communication piece roughly in the middle. And so when I think about students choosing careers, like what are the skill sets of that 700-page down to 10-page? I mean, it's like you're the essential link in a process, but could you talk a little more about what kinds of career paths might be part of that?
Well, I think perhaps, and I'm maybe speaking for not a great degree of knowledge here, but a strong weakness in a lot of scientific education is this lack of a focus on communication, because you often have people who do fantastic scientific work, very valuable or could be very useful, but somehow it's not presented in a way that actually communicates it to, to the audience that you want to target. So for the type of work that I'm doing, then it's essentially a communication role. You have to be good with people. It's not just focusing on experiments and numbers and analysis. So I think communication is a really key thing that is very often lacking in scientific education. And perhaps an aspect to that, I mentioned when we had dinner beforehand, is organizations like the University of the Arctic or the Association of Polar Career Scientists, who try to provide opportunities for young scientists to work, for example, in assessments that we do. So whenever we have a workshop or an event, we always try and ensure that we have young scientists that get the opportunity to perhaps find someone that might be able to mentor them, or that they can break into the world. Because very often when I'm sitting around a group of scientists working on these type of things, I'm the youngest person there, which is a scary thought. So I think that you just have to learn how to communicate what you're doing in a much more sort of cohesive way. Yep.
I have already my microphone.
Okay.
I'm just going to be faster. I was just wondering, biodiversity, you said, okay, whales, birds, the big ones. And I do the little things.
Yeah.
So is anyone looking at the bacterial, archaeal diversity in the ocean seafloor? Because I know that the Arctic sediments are also very affected, so it will change too. And bacteria archaea can produce methane, so...
Of course, they're much less known than the sort of more charismatic...
Do you have science there in this area? Or?
Yeah, there are lots of scientists working on this thing in different areas, and I can, if you give me your contacts afterwards, I can maybe send you some information about it. And in the assessment that I mentioned, we do have a chapter focusing on just that. Okay. But usually it's by guys who are about to retire, and there's no younger scientists to take over, so there's always a challenge like that. But that's one of the big gaps in knowledge as well, because the money, funding money, tends very often to go not to things like that, but rather to sort of, things that people can see and that are nice and pretty. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. That's okay, I don't mind who goes first.
So I was really interested in your figure that showed there was a serious deficit in conserved marine areas in the Arctic. Well, I guess it's largely marine.
Yeah.
What's the process? Under who does that be the Arctic Council that has to come into agreement, or how do you conserve that marine area?
Well, the Arctic Council has no mandate to do anything like that. This is just preliminary information that shows the extent and coverage of it. But you do then have a whole range of international processes, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity, where they identify areas that are sensitive to different things across the Arctic, and those type of things start to flow into potential measures that might be taken. But in the Arctic it's complicated because you have different countries claiming different areas, and until those things are resolved, it's quite difficult. But what they have done as the states, they've created now what they call a framework for marine protected areas in the Arctic, and as part of that, they try to look at these issues like, for example, that network of protected areas that you see there, is it representative? What does it actually protect, and things like that. So we can start to look at the science to underpin what might come later.
And then my second question that plays on that is, okay, so climate change is a huge threat to habitat, and that conserving the area isn't going to make it safe from climate change.
No.
But what are the biggest threats besides climate change impacting those areas? Is it fishing? Is it mineral, trying to pull mining, or what's the...
Well, when you mention things like fishing, the Arctic Council doesn't deal with fishing.
Yeah, okay.
So, but one of the items we were discussing over the last couple of days is the development of an implementation or a strategy and action plan for managing invasive species, because that has the potential to be have huge impacts in the Arctic. So what we're doing at the moment now is trying to negotiate a strategy for how we might put in place a plan or steps to try and stop those invasive species actually spreading or actually going beyond the doorstep of the Arctic. So there are lots of different threats, and it depends upon the topic at hand. So,
Thanks.
yep, no worries.
Back to the question of communication.
Yep.
I heard you talk about a lot about countries and the research you're doing with scientists.
Yeah.
But do you ever work with the oil companies and the shipping lane companies in the same sort of aspect? You know?
Well, what we've tried to do now is that we've held just recently, about a year or so ago, of the first Biodiversity Congress, and that part of that Arctic Biodiversity Congress, it was a huge scientific conference, was intended to be an outreach and sort of consultation process between different sectors, industry being one of them. And as an outcome of that, now we're starting to work on developing a set of biodiversity principles to see what can we provide tools for the Arctic Council and other sectors to consider and keep in mind when they're starting to look at development in the Arctic. So we begin to start to feel around how that cooperation might happen, and the Arctic Council itself facilitated the creation of what it calls the Arctic Economic Council about 2 or 3 years ago. So it's one of those discussions or conversations that's slowly starting to happen. But it's a challenging topic. For example, we just conducted a process last year to see a scoping study to see if we could determine a way to look at services provided by ecosystems in the Arctic, evaluation of ecosystems and things like that. So it gets, which is a very sensitive issue and can be very controversial. So, but it's challenging. And one thing in the Arctic that's sort of quite unique as well is that, as I mentioned, you've had all these indigenous organizations, there's 6 of them, represented on the Arctic Council. So we need to communicate not just to the Arctic states, but we need to also communicate it to local peoples and peoples who actually live in the Arctic. So the communication has to go to a number of different target groups. Everyone's nodding as if it's But so that's a very brief synopsis of what we do within our work. So, you know, to summarize it, we're on that divide between science and policy. We try to interpret what the scientists are saying and communicate those findings to people who can actually take decisions accordingly. It's a challenging process, but it's very rewarding. I would encourage any of the students or scientists to please try and engage in these processes, because as the US now is the chair of the Arctic Council, and actually the US takes the chairmanship of my working group, CAFF, next May. So the US will be guiding the board for which we work under, and a lot of our meetings will be in the States. And so presumably, usually when a country chairs a working group, they come with a set of priorities that they try to follow. So perhaps there might be linkages there for Maine in that process as well. So,
Are there any other questions?
any questions are good. It's okay.
Well, you're probably good with staying for a few minutes.
Yeah, I'm happy. Yeah, of course,
If you'd like to come up and speak to him personally. If I can just make a plug for a couple of the field science programs that St. Joseph's College offers. If you haven't yet enrolled in them and you're very interested in developing the skills over and above those that are taught in the classes, classroom-based courses here, there's an environmental science semester, which is a full credit, full semester course, which is out in the field right now. And they're out on a schooner somewhere north of Booth Bay Harbor, and they're doing ocean floor coring, and they're interpreting sediment depositions to try to get at climate change over time. And this is a program that St. Joe's runs every other year. It's the only one like it in the state, so I encourage you to check that out if you're interested. And then there were flyers distributed about a course that St. Joe's is offering that's going to Iceland next summer, and it's a 3-week course. So,
And Iceland is beautiful.
and it is going right through the university town where Mr. Barry lives and works. So please come down and introduce yourself, and let's give him a thank you for his time.
Thank you. Yeah.